really what we discuss from a terrain perspective, and that I don't want to just go through typical avalanche terrain, what you look for in terrain, et cetera, but I want to pull it into really trying to take a look at current conditions, all the observations that you can pull in, whether it's observations from the trailhead, observations from your car ride up, all the way down to, going to your local forecast center and getting your forecast reports, but pulling in all of your data and all your information to really make some decisions on your terrain management. So first we'll talk a little bit about kind of what is AVI terrain. But as you guys can see from my first slide here, terrain really intersects well with the snowpack, the weather, as well as the human factors. And so we're going to try to combine a little bit of the human factors as well as all the data that you would get from our snowpack and from our weather, and really try to pull it together and how we would make some terrain decisions, terrain management decisions. And for some reason, this one will go forward. There we go. So the question is can you guys recognize AVI terrain? Typically, the answer is kind of yes. And the reason being is because it's usually pretty obvious. We have these old growth paths that rip down these slopes, and time after time after time, we have avalanches that take place, usually on a yearly basis, and they create these pretty recognizable slide paths. Ironically, most of you guys recognize this as San G. This was taken from, I believe, Bear Mountain. The irony is it was just a couple weeks ago, I was at the top of Bear working as a patroller, and I had a customer come in and say, hey, how do I get to those runs over there? And we're trying to figure out what lifts they needed to take to get over to those runs without realizing and recognizing that obviously these are obvious slide paths. Bigger question is when they're not so obvious. So we have, oftentimes these little rollovers and little areas that are not so obvious as a slide path. This is a 80-foot, 90-foot slope within a treed area. It certainly hasn't lost any trees through any major slide paths, and yet this particular slide resulted in a fatality. Would you guys recognize this as a slide path normally? It's a good question. And the answer to that is probably not. A lot of folks wouldn't recognize this as a slide path. You might recognize the terrain itself as having a little bit of a rollover with some loading on it, certainly from the recent storm. The question is whether or not we can pull in the rest of the data that we get thrown at us, data from the avalanche centers, data from weather sites, data from what's taken place throughout the season, and try to pull that together to figure out whether or not this is terrain we should really be anywhere near. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So what about above tree line? How do we deal with terrain above tree line? How do we recognize AVI paths when we're just looking at a blank canvas? Well, obviously we can, number one, take a look at wind direction, figure out what our predominant wind direction is going to be during storms, and that'll tell us quite often what kind of loading we have within those zones, and try to figure out what zones we can ride that may not have as much loading, may not have quite the same issues or problems that we would want to work our way through and ski those zones. We're going to look at Cornice formations that'll tell us a little bit about those zones. We're going to look at everything from slope, angle, aspect, and elevation, and try to really figure out where we're going to plan to ride or ski, and what terrain choices we may have and terrain management we may have based upon the information that's being thrown at us. So these are, hopefully folks recognize, obviously this is Mammoth Mountain. And those who have been around Mammoth for quite a while will recognize certain areas that tend to slide more often and tend to have constant wind loading that takes place. I can't tell you how many times I've been up in Mammoth and watched the winds build and watched just, some movement, some snow banners, etc., that start filling in certain locations. and you can tell right away that that's getting some really good wind-loaded snow within it. Oftentimes it means it's, because we're inbounds within a resort, that may be an area where we want to go check out and actually do some riding. We were looking at this from a backcountry perspective. Those would be areas that we would want to avoid. If you look at the dropouts, quite often, right off of the dropouts, there's usually quite a bit of snow that builds up through their wind loading events. Typically, anything from the southwest is going to load that really nicely. I'm going to get into a couple of images here in a moment. Hey, Keith, folks are asking for the meeting passcode, just so you know. I think Ty is one of them. So ridges are often areas where we look to travel on, and those ridges, certainly on one side of the ridge, the windward side, can be a great place to travel. But on the opposite side of that, we have quite a bit of snow that ends up being transported, and those are usually pretty recognizable by the cornices that build up and the wind pillows that build up, and drifts that build up throughout that entire zone. And on the bright side is they're pretty obvious. You can see them from pretty far distances. Oftentimes we refer to these cornices as backcountry bombs, as they do tend to break off and release, especially when they get stiff and then soften up. And when they do release, they can release pretty big slides that occur through the instant loading within that slope. But they are indications also that just below these cornices are going to be areas where we have a lot of wind loading and a lot of snow buildup. And oftentimes those are the areas, most of the time, those are the areas that we're trying to avoid, especially when we see the big Cornice Formation and cornice buildup. So ridges, the key thing is really figuring out what your orientation to the wind is going to be. Are you on the windward side or on the leeward side? Remember, these are all collection zones, and those collection zones can shift, though, based upon the winds. I can't tell you how many times I've been in Mammoth and watched southwest winds pull in and load up all the good skiing, from dropouts, wipeouts, Cornice, Climax, Dave's, Roma's. And then 2 days later, we get a northeast wind, cold northeast wind at 60, 80 miles an hour that strips all that snow off. And I don't know, I think it deposits it somewhere in somewhere in Fresno. And so these do change quickly, and these collection zones can change quite rapidly. So we have to be aware of that. Typically in our maritime snowpack out west, we don't see quite the wind transportation events that they do see in Colorado and the Rockies and Utah, because we're not dealing with the same density of snow. So when you have a 3 or 4% snow, that's falling in Colorado or northern Rockies, quite often that snow gets transported much more rapidly. I see some questions. I'm not really monitoring the chat, Keith, so burning question. Oh, thank you. Get rid of the chat now. So when you look on all of our AVI forecasts, whether it's from Colorado, Utah, whether it's from here in Southern California, the Eastern Sierras, or even the Sierra Forecast, Avalanche Forecast Center, quite often you'll see the term pockets of instability. Does anyone know what that means? If you can type in the chat what you believe that means. Anyone? When you read pockets of instability on a avalanche forecast, what does that mean? You're right. So that, Quinn, that's usually snow that has been transported through wind events. And what it creates is it's these wind pillows, and those wind pillows typically can be stiff or hollow, and they usually have kind of a bulging effect on the snow. I'll try to show some pictures of some a little bit later. But those are what they determine. They deem these pockets of instability, and quite often when they get buried through an additional snow event, those pockets of instability, now you can release them. You can hit that sweet spot and trigger them and kick off either small slides that step down into a larger slide, or sometimes just trigger that pillow itself. But those pockets of instability are really created typically through these wind events. And so when you read that, you kind of know, hey, they've had some wind events that have created these wind pillows in the past. They may have been buried, and those pockets of instability may exist. Sometimes it's that shallow area of the snowpack that you hit as well that creates that pocket of instability. So oftentimes when you read that, you can kind of dig a little bit deeper and understand what's taking place within the terrain. That, hey, we've had some wind events. Let's look at those wind events and when they occurred, what direction the winds were out of. And then from there, you can figure out, hey, if they were from the southwest, well, so that means probably a lot of the northeast facing slopes might have those pockets of instability. And those are the ones that I may want to try to avoid. Any questions, comments? Alan takes all the concerns, so you're going to have to contact Alan if you have concerns. All right. So when I'm approaching on a windward side of a ridge, I do want to look at my approach angle as I come up to that ridge. So even though I'm trying to get to that ridge, I want to be careful about what I'm going up to get to that ridge and make sure it's an angle and an aspect that really is appropriate for the conditions. When we talk about fetch, it's really kind of the amount of area in which the snow can accumulate within that windward side and then get deposited on the leeward side. The acceleration term, the way we can kind of tell acceleration is by the scouring that we can see on that ridge line. So we may not have known really what the winds were during the storm as an example, but we noticed that it scoured almost all the way down to the rock. Well, that probably indicates that we had some pretty high winds, probably 60 miles an hour and up, and that we may expect that deposition to be a little bit further down on the opposite side, on the leeward side of that slope. We have simple scouring, such as sastrugi, that may indicate that, hey, the deposition zones may be at kind of our regular areas within that slope and the typical starting zones within the slope on the leeward side. So really try to take a look at what's taking place on that windward side, and that'll give you a clue as to really where your deposition zones might be on that leeward side. Remember, don't be fooled by that windward side. They still can avalanche if you have some light winds and that gets loaded on that scoured surface or that windboard surface. So do be aware of that. So this is what a little bit of sastrugi might look like, a little scouring, and this has taken enough snow from this. What direction do you think this is coming from? I'll give you a hint. It's going this direction. All right, so the leeward side, obviously we have this deceleration that takes place, which is why these cornices build up. They create that nice curl, and that's through that deceleration effect of the winds. They create these nice cornices, shallow pillows, and various wind slabs. And so all this is stuff that we want to be able to recognize on the leeward side of slopes. So far we have a couple of areas. We have ridges that we're dealing with, and those ridges create both a windward side and a leeward side typically. And within that, we have things that we're looking for. We're looking for cornices. We're looking for deposition of new snow. We have wind pillows that we may see. All of these things are factors in terms of decisions we have to make when we decide what terrain we're going to go ride. Anyone recognize this? If you can write in the chat where you think this might be. Chair 23. Yeah, this is the dropouts at Mammoth. What's interesting about this, as you can see, this was a very large avalanche. There was a lot of wind loading that took place during this event. This crown was, I think, at spots almost 30 feet. What's most interesting about this is this took 5 shots from the howitzer, and it didn't release. And it finally took a patroller running over to this zone right here over on, I think it's drop out 3, and throwing a single hand charge. And that single hand charge released this entire slope, but they couldn't get it to release through the howitzer. And so it took getting to one of these thin zones here, these margins, to affect the slope, and it propagated all the way out into a much larger release all the way out into dropout 1. But this goes to show you, really, sometimes you can't affect these larger, thicker slabs. They just insulate that weak layer too well, and you have to get into the thin margins in order to really affect them. The problem is you may not know where that thin margin is going to be. That thin margin, you know, certainly could have been up here, it could have been over here. Who knows where you're going to hit that thin margin where you finally affect that snowpack, and it rips out all the way through. All right, other things we look at, and these are get a little more complicated, these knobs, spines, coals, notches, etc., because you're getting not only loading straight up over the top, but you're getting cross loading and side loading that occurs on the slope as well. And so as we see these knobs and ridges, these are areas where all of a sudden now we have a bunch of different, more complex starting zones and more complex pockets of instability that might affect our release points. And so when you see them, you want to recognize them and recognize that, hey, it's not just your traditional loaded area. It could be some side loading that takes place from it, and cross loading that takes place as well. We're going to pull all this together in a few minutes here. All right, so this is typically what we see with cross loading. We have our wind direction, and we have these ridges now that we might see, you know, on these slopes. And as the wind really blows across the slope, it's going to go through that deceleration phase, load up that area just beyond the ridge lines, create maybe a cornice all the way up and down this side slope here, and then deposit more snow as we hit each one of these ridges. So we end up with a bunch of snow within, you know, these little kind of mini couloirs, these little sections. However, it's loaded all the way up and down the slope as opposed to just on the top of the slope. What's interesting is the scouring that you're going to see. You're going to see areas of very little snow on that slope, and then areas with a bunch of snow on that slope. And so quite often it looks like you're traveling in a scoured area, but as you move over into the deposition where we see that decelerization, we're going to see a lot more snow loading up within those zones. Anyone ever seen Mammoth where you see that rippled effect all the way across the mountain? We have this lower picture, kind of, it's a great example of that. Mammoth gets so many wind events. It really has some great examples of what you would see when you see lots of wind that's loading up a slope. Some more images of both cross loading as well as loading straight over the ridge line. We have these spines that come down. Those create really nice areas for cross loading. We have a couple of obvious avalanche signs up here. We have our loading from our cornices up off top. And to me, this actually looks like it's received quite a bit of sun as well. And so not only did we have this loading event that took place, but it looked like we also had some sun that hit it right afterwards. So this has, within this one zone right here, we have a couple of things that potentially are coming into play. We have solar radiation that might be heating it up. We have some side loading that takes place, and then we have some loading straight over the ridge line. I love this picture for a couple of reasons. Number one, if we were looking for terrain choices to ski, this is a great example of an area that I would kind of look for. It other than the loading that's taking place here in terms of the shape, the interesting part about this is, let's say something did happen and you got caught in a slide. We actually have an area that doesn't have a whole lot of a volume of snow potentially, meaning that we might be in any one of these little, we'll call them mini couloirs. So it's not going to potentially break all the way through, but what's more interesting is it fans out at the very bottom. And so it's going to actually spread that snow out. So when you look for, areas that you want to kind of ride where you're maybe you're in a moderate condition and there's pockets of instability, but you still want to be safe. These might be areas or zones that you'd want to go take a look at, slopes that have this kind of shape, because it allows for, if an event actually did take place, it's going to spread out at the bottom as opposed to putting you into a nice terrain trap or pushing you over a cliff. The problem is with this slope, what do we see here? We see side loading that scoured from, it looks like from my side right to left. And then we have some loading that came up over the ridge. And I put a little circle here because oftentimes that's going to be your thin margin, and that's going to be the area where, probably as you get into this is going to be a typical starting zone. And then that upper section, if I were to move this circle over, this is a great example of a giant wind pillow, essentially, that's formed at the top of the slope. You also see a lot of loading and wind drifts all the way up and down the slope with this cornice, and that tells us we had our side loading event that took place as well. We look over here and we see another margin of loading that took place off of this ridge line as well. So we have loading potentially that took place from 3 different sides here, one over straight over the top, and then more loading that took place around it. So when you guys see zones like this, while they look like great areas to go, go ski, because this is where a lot of the snow is at. You can see there's a ton of loading here, and you're going to want to really evaluate whether or not that's a good decision or good choice. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to make those decisions and the decision-making process you may want to go through as we start to look at terrain and then terrain management. Convexities. So, we see these convexities all the time as we ski. Slopes aren't planar, they're not flat. They have rollovers, they have spines, they have all these fun little features. But these convexities are certainly points within a slope that create a lot more tension. And really, when I'm skiing the backcountry, I have a rule that I just don't ski straight over a convexity. As I come up to each convexity that I'm skiing down, either I stop above it and we decide really what our next steps are going to be, or if, we're skiing with, and going through a safe zone, and part of that is going over a small little convexity. As I go over that convexity, I usually make a hard ski cut to one side or the other, usually trying to figure out what that safe zone is going to be. So as I came over this convexity, I'd want to certainly make a turn one way or the other and not just go straight down that convexity. So it's a good habit to get into as you ski in the backcountry, is to go ahead and not ski straight over these convexities. Go ahead and, number one, be cautious of them because they are stress zones within our slopes. But number two, make sure that you have a safe zone as you turn across that convexity and kind of ski cut it. I'm going to stop for a moment. I've gone through quite a few slides. I haven't been able to look at the chats. Keith, do we have any questions in the chat?
Not yet, Jeff. Most of the questions will come in the question and answer, but again, if folks have something that they want answered timely and it's a burning question, do feel free to put it in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Any comments you guys may have as well, feel free. Don't be shy. All right, these little valleys, valleys are not necessarily terrain features that we look at from an avalanche starting zone. Unfortunately, these valleys are areas of consequence for these avalanches that may occur above you. In other words, they're catch basins or terrain traps for us. And certainly staying out of V-shaped valleys is important. This particular slide right here, this coincides with one of the first pictures that I showed. This is that 80-foot or so slope, and this is the terrain trap that formed right below it. And this person ended up being buried about 11 feet deep from a very small slide in terms of size. It was still almost a 2-foot crown.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
We've got a good question here. If you're willing to back up a slide, Uwe asks, can you show a line how you would ski the terrain shown in the convexity slide? So
Sure.
use your cursor to show them
I can
where you might find an island of
I
safety.
can annotate it here, I think. Spotlight it. Here we go. So let's say we were skiing down this zone right here, and ironically, it's going to be in this direction. So as I came down, I'd probably hit this convexity and head over to an island of safety. Certainly, and you never know. You don't know really where this thin margin is going to be. You can see the thin margins here, and it goes over to a thicker margin. If I was skiing this line over here, as an example, I may cut this and head over this direction. It's hard to see from over this direction, but certainly here I might go this direction.
It's good to point out we oftentimes have a second target zone, so that if your first planned bailout spot aiming for an island of safety is not going to get you there speedily enough, you may be looking downhill before you come over that rollover, thinking about where you can straight line it for a few seconds and still make it somewhere further downhill.
I will say when I was in my 20s, it might be this. As the pro skiers do and outrun these things, most of us don't have those ski skills. So watching these pro skiers all of a sudden kick off a slide and then hit 80 miles an hour down a slope, that's unfortunately that is probably not the skill sets that many of us have. Maybe in our minds we have, but reality proves something different. Did I answer the question?
I think you did. Thank you.
Uh-oh. How do I unannotate? All right. So this particular zone ended up being a terrain trap, and really a deep burial from a very small slide. So these are areas you want to stay away from. That U-shaped valley, though, oftentimes people think that, hey, these can be pretty safe to travel in. However, you have to take a look at the conditions that are existing. As an example, when we have conditions in Colorado and Utah right now where we have a persistent deep layers, slabs that can be anywhere from 8 to 10 feet deep that are being triggered, and the size of the avalanches are historic, this has gotten people into trouble. They're down in U-shaped valleys on the valley floor, remote triggering some of these things, and they're actually flowing further and longer than anyone had anticipated. And so you have to understand the conditions that go along with it, and make your decisions of your travel based upon not what's traditional, but what you're seeing at that moment, what's happening at that very instant. Don't fall into the heuristic traps that we see often of familiarity. Hey man, I've skied this 100 times and it's never slid. Don't fall into that heuristic trap. Take each individual moment for what it's worth and analyze each moment and make your decisions based upon that moment. And that's going to be really kind of the theme of the rest of this presentation, is thinking about those what's going on at that moment, how to collect that information, and where you go to get it. And then I'm going to give some examples, and we're going to talk a little bit about decisions that you may make based upon what those conditions may be. So here's that U-shaped valley that some might think might be fairly safe to ski on, and you could see, boy, if I was traveling up that U-shaped valley, and there's a road down there, by the way, this would not end up well for me. Other considerations, let me get rid of this. As I'm making my terrain choices, I want to make sure, hey, that I have some good exits. What are my choices? What are the consequences if something bad were to happen? Am I going to be, thrown through a gully onto a road? Are there any flat benches that could be, big terrain traps, rocks that might be there, trees, cliffs within that terrain that I might be, I might be in a pretty neat area in terms of skiing, but if I get caught in a slide, it's going to throw me right over that cliff. These are all consequences of events that might take place. And your decisions in terms of your terrain management should be made based upon the conditions that you're seeing at the moment, what's in the forecast, and whether or not the consequences I want to take. Meaning, could be a low consequence spring day, and I decide I'm going to go ski this one line that has a little bit of cliff exposure, but that's all right because I'm going to turn before those and get into a couloir. Okay, that might be a decision you make. Now, making that same decision at 1:30 p.m. on a spring hot sunny day where we had no overnight freeze might be a different decision that I have to make, because now I have to deal with maybe a wet loose slide that might kick off at the top and entrench me and throw me right over that cliff line. So it's all about your timing. It's all about at that moment, and you have to evaluate these things as you go. Crevasses, I know our local Mount Baldy crevasses have shrunk over the last couple thousand years, I guess. But if you are skiing in areas with glaciers, etc., you think about, is there crevasses in the line I'm going to ski or within that zone? Some people don't think about lakes. They think about, wow, easy ways to kind of access a zone or exit a zone, but at the same time, you throw a couple of million tons onto a lake, an alpine lake, and you might be in a little bit more trouble than you think. Rivers and creeks, whether or not I'm going to be swept into a river or creek, usually that means it's also a flat zone or kind of a V-shaped valley anyways, and so it's also going to probably involve a little deeper burial, and then you add the water mixture to it, and all of a sudden, there's some dangerous areas. Complex terrain. What do I mean by complex terrain? There's some, fairly good examples in some of the images I've shown previously about complex terrain, but your decisions in complex terrain may change. So just going over one ridge line as I move through some complex terrain could all of a sudden put me into a zone that is slightly different aspect that now all of a sudden has completely different conditions in it. Or that complex terrain, as I ski through it, I might hit a couple of rollovers that might be zones in which I all of a sudden create quite a bit of tension. Or complex terrain where we had strong wind events and we've loaded the slope much further down on the slope as opposed to its normal starting zones. All these things are considerations as you guys decide to move through your terrain and go through your terrain management. And I can't emphasize this V-shaped valley enough, especially here in Southern California. No matter what kind of avalanche airbag you have, whatever you believe you may have is going to keep you on the surface, if you get thrown into that V-shaped valley, you're in for a deep burial, and no airbag is going to keep you out of it. And those deep burials have very, very low rates of they have very low rates of live recoveries in. And so staying out of those V-shaped valleys is really, really important. In Southern California, we have a lot more of them, and it becomes rather difficult kind of to stay out of them. So you really have to think about where you're skiing and what your choices are here in SoCal because of those. We've kind of gone through the cornices, but these are the anatomy of a cornice. I threw this in because number one, I can't get over the enormity of the cornice that's sitting right there. I have no idea if this guy's standing on another ginormous cornice. I hope not. But when you see that kind of cornice formation, it's amazing. All right, other things to think about. Now we've talked about, well, we haven't talked about angle yet, but we've certainly talked about all these terrain features. But there's also aspect that we have talked a little bit about, meaning from a wind direction primarily. But the other aspect to think about is what your solar exposure is going to be. These big, western facing, eastern facing bowls, or even southern facing bowls. Baldy Bowl is a great example. where all of a sudden we have a lot of solar radiation effects that hit these bowls. Those are things to consider about when you're going to travel in this terrain, meaning timing is important. And certainly as we get into spring skiing, some of these big bowls we get into, even on the northern aspects now, we have to consider what that solar radiation and how that's affecting the slope. Typically, we look at a couple of things. Number one, did it go through a freeze-thaw cycle? If it didn't, meaning that it never froze that night, it's going to warm up much faster. We also tend to, I look at least, whether or not I'm getting how much ski penetration or boot penetration I'm getting as I'm traveling. And if I'm starting to get, certainly boot top when I walk, or starting to get a couple of inches of penetration when I ski, I'm realizing that, hey, we're getting into some pretty sloppy snow right now, and there's quite a bit of water. If you reach down and squeeze that upper surface and you start to get water that flows through it as you try to make a snowball, that's going to tell you an awful lot about what the solar radiation effects are within that slope. Planning your trip, meaning you may want to leave, early in the morning, early, 3, 4 in the morning at dark and headlamps, so that you can get up and get to the zone you want to ski and ski it within a certain time frame, so that you're off the slope by 11, who knows, or off by 1. But planning your trip and basing it upon the weather and your freeze thaw cycles and what kind of solar radiation you're going to get within the area that you're going to is important. There's Baldy Bowl. I had to give you a good example, but these are some other things that affect solar radiation. What's interesting is when you look at rocky outcrops within these zones, that's usually your starting point. Up in Baldy Bowl, I can almost guarantee after a storm, and then we have a warming event that occurs right after, we're going to start to see wet slides that come off of these rocks right through here. This is the danger zone almost every time. You want to avoid those rocks as your starting zone. So certainly if you're in an area where you're suspecting some solar radiation, remember that solar radiation and the stress points are going to be much higher at those rocks, and you're going to want to avoid those. Thin cloud cover, that also bounces back that shortwave radiation and allows it to penetrate the snowpack a little more effectively, and it reflects that long wave radiation as it comes back to the snowpack. So remember that, just a slight cloud cover, even though it feels like you're not getting as much sun on it, you may have quite a bit more solar radiation that's affecting your snowpack. Great examples of, direct evidence of solar radiation on a snowpack. All right, these are the things that are really going to really impact the terrain factors that are going to impact the snowpack. So we have angle, elevation, aspect, the shape and contour of a slope. Is it planar? Is it convex? Is it concave? What is the shape of the slope? The roughness, meaning what anchors do I have within that slope? Do I have a bunch of rocks? Do I have a bunch of trees within that slope as anchors? Do I have a bunch of vegetation underneath? All those things are going to affect really my considerations in the terrain that I'm traveling in. And then finally, the vegetation that I may have at the bottom of the slope. Those could also potentially affect it. And is it on grass? Is it on, thin, shale? What is the bottom surface of this snowpack, and how much vegetation do I have around? So how would I pull in, as I look at conditions, how would I think about all these: angle, elevation, aspect, shape, surface roughness, etc.? Well, I'm going to look at the AVI forecast. I'm going to look at the history that's taken place in terms of weather events throughout the season. I'm going to then, as I travel, I'm going to be taking into account the direct evidence that I see Do I see roller balls, pinwheels? Do I see previous avalanche activity? Do I see cornice activity? Maybe cornices are starting to fall and drop. All of these things I'm going to pay attention to as I travel. And when I see these signs and this evidence, I'm also going to take into account what aspect that's at and what elevation is that, is that evidence located. And I'm going to note that down, and I'm going to note, basically think that all slopes within that aspect and elevation are going to be suspect. And then from there, I'm going to try to evaluate the snow a little bit more and figure out what terrain I want to get into. So my plan is starting to take shape. I should have them before I go, and then I'm going to have the ability to make those changes in terms of the terrain I may want to ski, based upon the evidence that I have as I start to travel within my zones. Angle. What is the magic angle for AVI conditions? Anyone? Throw this in the chat. This has been discussed over the last couple of, got 38 degrees. I like Chris's answer. 35 to 45 is certainly a great zone. Anything more than 30 from Jacqueline. So certainly anything more than 30 could potentially be. Typically, we're looking at 35 to 45, 38. That might be that magic number. So those of you familiar with Mammoth, what do you think? What do you think some of your favorite runs are at Mammoth? Well, here we go. So we have elevation, we have aspect, and we have angle here that we have at our fingertips for Mammoth, fortunately. So what do we have? We have Cornice, 38 degrees, that perfect zone. Dropout 1, 36 degrees, kind of surprises me. Dropout 2 at 47. 52 for MJB's Varmints Nest at 52. Anyways, when you also look at their aspect, we basically have almost all, this is MJB's due north, but we have north, northwest, northeast facing slopes for the most part. And elevation, we could see the elevation for these is all about the same. I think they take it from the lift. All right, so we've talked about all these areas, all these terrain features that affect avalanches within our backcountry. So what's left to ski? Do we have anything left to ski? Well, if you just took this presentation on its face, you'd probably say, well, no, I don't have anything left to ski in the backcountry. Those are all the fun areas I want to get into. So the key is how do we manage this terrain? And we manage that terrain by using our avalanche bulletins and warnings, monitoring them, understanding how to read them, and then from there, following those bulletins throughout the season so that I know how the season's progressing. Following the weather of the areas that I like to ski and the areas that I may have plans to do some backcountry skiing all throughout the season. Charting it, being diligent in terms of how you're going to use this information. For me, though, what I like to do is, as I plan to go out, is I want to identify the problems within the snowpack. And there may be 3 of them, there may be 4 of them, who knows? So maybe the number one problem I have is going to be, we had a wind event, and so wind loading and wind slabs are what I'm most worried about. Okay. Number 2 problem might be a rain crust that fell in at the beginning of February, and I'm worried about that rain crust and how it's interfacing with the upper snowpack, and potentially worried about maybe fastening that might be growing within that rain crust. And maybe the number 3 component of this might be that persistent weak layer that might be that faceted layer below that rain crust. So those might be my 3 problems that I've identified, and each one of those problems I may want to rank based upon the likelihood in which it might occur. And as I start to go through my plan, I'm going to now take into account. So if this wind slab is my number 1 problem that I'm worried about, and its likelihood of releasing slides is high, then I'm going to want to know what wind direction the wind was blowing that created this wind slab, and I'm going to want to stay off of those slopes and stay off of that aspect, right? If my number one problem might be that deep persistent slab, well, what elevation did that rain crust take place? If it's anything below 9,000 feet, well, great. Maybe above 9,000 feet might be where I go, because that area wasn't affected by that rain crust, and therefore I may not see the fastening that could take place, right? If that rain crust went top to bottom, well, it's going to rain on all aspects as well, so I may see that persistent weak layer from that faceted snow all over the mountain, right? So now I'm going to have to think about what angle is that being affected by, and start thinking about what angle slopes that I'm going to want to stay away from. And maybe I go ski low angle slopes that don't have any exposure from above. If I have new snow that fell, well, okay, I have that new storm slab that's going to fall in all aspects, right? But now we add in the wind loading and the areas where there's heavier wind, and then we add in the angles that I want to stay away from, and I create my trip plan based upon that. But treat each trip as an individual trip. Don't throw in any previous thoughts you may have from previous examples of skiing in the same area. Throw that out the door and approach it individually, because the snowpack was not the same as any other time that you've ever skied it. It is going to be different. We talked about the bullseye approach in some of our other presentations. I don't think I'm going to go into the bullseye, but if you guys want to look up the bullseye approach, that'd be great. It essentially deals with class 1, class 2, and class 3 data. And the most important being that class 1 data, that information that I see right in front of me, that evidence, direct evidence of slides, cracking, wumping, collapsing of snow, all those things that occur as I'm traveling, previous avalanche activity, all of those are a part of that. And then finally, what are the consequences of the terrain I'm planning to ski in? I don't want to ski in a moderate day in areas where all of a sudden if I get caught in a slide, it's going to throw me up over a cliff. Maybe I want to pick a slope that fans out and actually provides a nice escape route for me. I'll let you guys read through this since I just talked about it, but all right. So this was actually on February 24th, so that was yesterday. This was the avalanche forecast for yesterday in Salt Lake City area. So essentially they have these upper elevations on the north where they have a considerable rating. They have moderate for anything on the western to southwestern, southeastern slopes, and then green rating at lower elevations. All right. So essentially this means that, hey, there's some dangerous conditions. Cornices should be avoided. It tells you kind of everything you need to know within this. They still have those east-facing slopes where weak faceted snow exists, and any wind-drifted snow is also there. So let's think about now this next slide, which is, hey, all right, based upon those conditions, where would I choose to go recreate in? Where would I go ski? You can see some ski tracks within this right now. Those ski tracks certainly are up through this zone right here. And most folks in this area end up going up through these trees, traveling up over this direction, and then skiing this low angled slope right here, which is at 30 degrees, 30, 31 degrees, and then they exit. This zone right here hits 35, 36. Clearly, this is a steeper zone with some heavy conditions. You can see some loading that's up here, and this is a little steeper zone. So these folks are staying out of this zone and out of this area, and they're skiing on the, this is still, it looks like it's a northeast facing slope, something like that. And they're skiing this zone. Might be a good choice, right? Now let's take a look at this. This was on the 19th of February, and let's consider this for the same zone. Now we look at the same slope. Is this good terrain decisions, good terrain choices? Remember, we have mostly considerable to high avalanche danger. While they're staying at the lower elevations, they've at least managed to get into this considerable area. But at the same time, look at what we have here. We have human-triggered avalanches likely in avalanche terrain, aspects and elevations, on all aspects and elevations. And it also says down here, the avalanche you trigger may step down to a deeply buried layer, creating large and destructive avalanches, 6 to 8 feet deep and hundreds of feet wide, right? So, well, now I'm getting into a questionable zone, right? We can certainly affect this zone here. We can affect this zone here. Maybe not so much over in this area because it's going to run into a completely different zone. So maybe my decisions are going to be different. I see something in the chat here. Alan points out, yes, good to know. Considerable is where most avalanches occur, especially on sunny days. Let me get rid of the chat. All right, let's go into the next. And so this is that zone. And now I'm going to jump into, hopefully you guys can see my screen still.
Jeff,
all right. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, at this point, we're just looking at your, at the PowerPoint.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so this is an avalanche that took place where 2 different parties, total of 8 people, were caught in a slide. That slide ended up killing 4, buried a total of 6. All 8 were caught. And guess what? Does the slope look familiar? This is the same slope. All the groups were traveling up these trees, and they were heading this direction just where I sent you. And the top skier got to right about this tree point right here. I think it was this tree point, and ended up kicking off the slide that propagated all the way across. He got pulled into these trees, managed to grab a tree, stayed on the surface. Both of his skis were ripped away from him. Other 2 were at this tree section right here. They were buried. I think he had another buddy that ended up wasn't caught at all. I think he was up in this zone here. These 2 ended up initiating a recovery for the 2 that were just below them. Ended up digging them both out safely and saving their lives. There was another 4 that were below that were in these tree section here and got thrown through the trees and buried very deep. But let's take a look at kind of these conditions. Here's an example of the size of the crown. Here's the slope, by the way. The slope is at 30 degrees at where it started, at least where it initiated. This is that picture that I showed you. This was actually taken the same day. They had already had 14 different tracks down the slope. You could kind of see where they ascended and kind of where some of the bodies were found. There's going to be X marks that are within this. So here's the first skier that was not caught. Here's the second skier. He was caught up into this tree. Oh, sorry. The 2 skiers that they undug first were these 2 down here who they saved their lives. And then the other skiers all the way over here, Sarah, Louis, Thomas, they were all over in this zone right here. So these 4 folks did not make it. This would be the depth of one of the live recoveries. Happened to be, I think, Ethan. And then these were some of the burials of the others within that zone. And this is kind of looking down. So I'm going to stop.
That's kind
and
of
go
surprising because they were so far into the trees.
Exactly. But let me get into my presentation again. And this was the hazard rating for that day. So what happened? They made their decisions based upon terrain that they would normally ski, terrain decisions that would be good for certain conditions that existed, but they didn't adjust their decisions to ski that terrain based upon the current conditions. I mean, this was high avalanche danger in all elevations aspects. And not only that, this it says right there, a great day to ride at a resort, or go bowling, or go to the local brewery, although they're in Utah, so maybe not a great choice. But the point being is also what it showed within this, and I didn't throw this into this report, but the number one problem that they're worried about was deep, persistent slabs that could break 6 to 10 feet deep and could travel and propagate out thousands of feet and travel historic distances. And the likelihood of triggering them was very likely. So with all that information that we have through this Avalanche Forecast Center, and they chose to make their decisions of terrain choices based upon kind of what they had always done. Ironically, I went back and looked at that particular slope, which is called Wilson Glade, and it does have a history of 9 avalanches throughout the years. So it's not like it's my guess is it happens further to the right on that picture that I showed previously. So with that being said, that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. I kind of want to have a dramatic ending, a sad ending. I don't like, by the way, doing Monday morning forecasts on this stuff. You know, it's not really fair to those folks and what they were doing, but at the same time, this is something that is very relevant in terms of our terrain decisions. And so I think we can all kind of learn from it. I mean, I will admit the route that they chose on a normal day would be a route that I would probably choose. And I think quite a few of us would on this call. And on a normal day, that would be great, safe decision making that they made, but not on this day.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Let's open it up for questions, and Jeff will provide us some answers.
Hopefully.
So Kelsey asks, what types of things on Windward Side would tell us would give us information about the leeward side? Can you provide a few examples?
Yeah. So if we're on the Windward Side and it's scoured down to dirt, right, and rocks, and there's not much snow on it, and we have big Cornice Formation on the leeward side, that's going to tell me that we had a fairly major wind event, or a couple of wind events, or constant major wind events that are fairly high winds and end up transporting quite a bit of that snow onto that leeward side slope. The other things that I would think about is if they're heavy winds, 60 plus miles an hour, that means that loading zone is also going to take place much further down the slope than anticipated. And so those are things that I take into consideration.
Kelsey also asks, were you saying snow gets more radiation on days with clouds versus sunny skies? That's a good question, Kelsey.
The answer to that is it depends on your aspect. So if I am on a west facing slope, or an east facing slope, even worse, where I get it first thing in the morning, on a sunny day, it's going to get that constant radiation all throughout the day, and it's pretty intense. If I'm on a north facing slope with some cloud cover and a spring day with slight cloud cover, meaning not heavy cloud cover, just light cloud cover, well, that long wave radiation bounce back is going to affect that northern slope a little bit more. Whereas normally it's not going to be affected solely by the solar radiation that we're getting straight from the sun.
Yeah, bear in mind that the radiation we get from the sun is generally shortwave radiation. The Earth
Right.
is emitting long wave radiation, and it can bounce off cloud cover, reflect back down, and we've seen this in the field. Conditions deteriorate very, very rapidly, even though the ambient temperature hasn't changed, and it doesn't feel like we're getting much sunlight through the clouds. It's that long wave radiation that's reflecting back down that can have such a dramatic impact very quickly. Other questions? Let me catch up with the chat. Tim's asking about the slides. I'll point out that the bulk of the presentation will be up on YouTube on the Avalanche Center's channel by tomorrow evening.
I think there was a question on how that slide was triggered, and I think Alan answered, kind of answered, because he said on the uphill. I think what Alan meant was on the uphill travel, and he is correct. So all parties were in uphill travel mode when that slide got triggered.
Quinn has a question. He asks, on days with deep persistent weak layers, would you intentionally avoid shallow areas and ride deeper, more loaded areas where you are less likely to trigger down to a deep layer? Quinn's aware that the average skier or snowboarder is only able to affect about the top meter of the snow surface.
Yeah, tricky question, Quinn, because that deep persistent slab is that lurking dragon. It's what's waiting for that trigger, and what is the amount of load that's going to be the tipping point is the question. Unfortunately, for me, I become very hesitant and very cautious when our number one avalanche problem is a deep persistent weak layer. I tend to just travel on low angle slopes with low consequences, try to stay away from areas that are connected to much bigger slopes, and recognize that these slides can travel and will travel much further and much bigger than we ever anticipate. And so, it really depends upon your risk reward. Sometimes we get through the season and enough snow bridging is built up where, maybe we have dealt with that deep persistent weak layer that's there. I hate to say it, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, those areas are going to be dealing with that deep persistent weak layer all the way into the spring. So it's not going away.
But Quinn, it's a good point that avoiding those shallow areas, typically those margins on the sides of the slopes, can be real dangerous trigger points. And everyone should bear in mind that even though you as a skier may not be able to trigger a deep and persistent weak layer, you as a skier or snowboarder cutting loose a small, maybe not very dangerous slide yourself, and transporting a whole bunch of snow down the slope, that the combination of you and that slope can potentially produce enough stress on the slope to trigger that deep layer.
And also keep in mind, Quinn, that while you're skiing that that much deeper, thicker, heavier slab, when it does break, those are unsurvivable avalanches typically. When you're getting into 6, 8, 10-foot crowns, those are typically unsurvivable. I mean, you might get lucky, but not very often.
Let's see, Tanya has a call out to any of the other female attendees to see if they're interested in an all-lady tour. Check the chat. She's given her information. Any other questions for Jeff? All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. We appreciate your presentation tonight and your information. Alan, tonight we are sponsored. The program tonight is sponsored by La Sportiva and by New Belgium Brewing again. And we have some swag to give away. So Jeff isn't going to go anywhere. He's going to ask you some questions. We'll do this as we've done it in the past. Our raffle